I thought the sun rose in your arms, and the moon and stars were the gifts you gave to the dark and the empty skies, my love. To the dark and the empty skies. The first time ever I kissed your mouth, I felt the earth move in my hand, like the trembling heart of a captive bird that was there at my command, my love, that was there at my command.
Okay. It's 6:35, so I think we'll get going. Over to you, Ali, to begin.
Yeah, hi. Today we have interpretation available. This means that if you're not bilingual, you'll have to pick a channel in order to fully listen. If you are bilingual, English, Spanish, you can just stay in the main audio. We'll go over how to use this real quick. After this announcement, you'll see a globe icon at the bottom side of your screen pop up. There, you can select the language you want to hear. If you're on your phone, you'll see 3 dots appear at the bottom. Click on that and choose the language of your preference. Repeat, if you are English speaker, select English. If you're a Spanish speaker, select Spanish. Speaker, remember to well position your microphone and speak at a moderate pace. And if there are any problems, well, just please write in the chat. Hola, hoy contamos con interpretación disponible. Si usted no es bilingüe, tiene que escoger un canal para escuchar bien. En caso que usted sea bilingüe, o sea, habla inglés y español, se puede quedar en esta sala principal. Vamos a repasar cómo usar esto. Después de este anuncio, podrá ver el icono de un mundo aparecer en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Ahí puede seleccionar el idioma que quiere escuchar. Si está en su celular, verá 3 puntitos aparecer en la parte de abajo. Dele clic y escoja el idioma de su preferencia. Repito, si usted únicamente habla inglés, tiene que escoger el canal de inglés. Y si únicamente habla español, tiene que escoger el canal de español. A los participantes, hablar bien a su micrófono y hablar en una voz moderada. Si tiene algún problema haciendo esto, por favor, escriba en el chat. Y I'm seeing the comment on the English. Just select the English channel. If you only speak English, select the English channel. Excelente. Good. Elizabeth, we could start.
Okay. So if you click, I think it's the globe icon at the bottom. I think my screen looks a little bit different, but if you click the globe, that's where you should get it. All right. Thank you, Ali. Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for being with us on this Wednesday, night. I am Jules Chillog. I'll introduce myself more formally in a second, but first I want to invite you to do whatever it is your body and mind need. You can have your camera on or off. You can eat, move around, stretch, whatever it is that you need. And we're here to learn to support your children or students, but that starts with you feeling taken care of as well. So do whatever it is you need for that. I also want to start with a land acknowledgement, and it sounds like we have folks here from all kinds of places. I am on unceded Canarsie Lenape land, also known as Queens, New York. And I share this because we're talking about education and liberation, and we can't think about that without thinking about subtler colonialism. I have this visual on the side that lists some principles of some First Peoples. These are from some First Nations in Canada. And a lot of it is built on like relationships and the land and patience and time and identity. And yeah, I grew up in Canada, so I know a little bit more about First Nations folks than the Native peoples of the occupied lands of the United States, but essentially you'll see some of these themes woven through today's presentation because yeah, there are strengths in that type of teaching and learning that would help our learners. I also want to just ground us in some community norms. I won't read them each one by one, but if you have a question about it, you can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you, or you can just react with like a thumbs up if you agree that if you do share, you'll speak from your own experience. I'm going to aim to continue to center BIPOC perspectives, having a shared responsibility while recognizing that we're individuals. The cookie dough idea means you can share an idea even if it's not fully formed or baked, I guess. And if you are talking, just be mindful of how much you're talking, but the chat also allows for lots of people to contribute, which I think is great. So I like to be transparent about my own goals. So I'm going to start with that, and that will lead to the agenda. My goal is to center the perspective of dyslexic people. And I'll share in a second that I myself am not dyslexic. It's sort of to reframe a little bit about how we think about school and disability, and also to provide some concrete strategies, which if they're not new for you, that's great. That means you're already doing them, and hopefully that's validating. This is what this will look like. We're going to sort of try to connect, figure out who's here, ground in discussion of some language and ideas, and then we'll learn from some dyslexic individuals. I'll share tips, and then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. But even during, especially if you have a clarifying question, you are absolutely invited to put that in the chat or raise your hand. As I'll share in a second, I think people's identities are more important in some ways than like sort of professional things. So I want to start by sharing my identities. I think for today's discussion, the most important thing is that I'm non-disabled and non-dyslexic. That is sort of most relevant for this context, but I also just want to share my other identities because these all inform how I think about disability and dyslexia. But if you do want to hear about my professional experiences, I guess that doesn't require quotation marks, is that I am a speech language therapist by training. I work at a couple of institutions, and I wrote a book about how technology can support dyslexic learners, and some of that will be woven throughout today as well. Okay, so that's who I am. I want to know who you are if you're comfortable sharing. You can put this in the chat either for everyone, or you can message it just to me if that makes you feel more comfortable. Share your name if you'd like your pronouns and why you're here, goals that you have, questions that you have, and hopefully we'll get to all of that today. Awesome. Welcome, Yvonne. And wow, it is, I guess, tomorrow there, right? Is that right? You're ahead? Yeah. And that's beautiful. New Zealand's one of the most beautiful places on the planet, at least that I have traveled to. Excellent. Welcome, Jen. Oh, nice, Yvonne. Interesting. Okay. Yes, and deafness and literacy is interesting as well, but this will be more relevant, yes, to the second group. Someone else shared they're here to teach dyslexic scholars. And home educator, welcome. Excellent. Husband and 2 sons are great. And in the UK, wow, so many time zones represented. And working in a school, welcome Ida, welcome Rachel. Great. You can keep adding that. I will move on for time, but this is great. And I promise I won't just be monologuing with you, but I do want to share some things that I think are sort of true, which is that education is political. You all came to an event under liberation schools, so hopefully that's not too big of a stretch. As I think I said before, experts have lived experience, so everything I'm sharing today is based off of things that dyslexic folks have said and shared. It also actually happens to be research validated, just the research tends to be behind what people with lived experience say. Anti-oppression work must be intersectional, and I'll define intersectionality in a second. We all have power and spheres of influence, which is great because that means we can all help make the world a more just and accessible space. And we all have worth and value unconditionally, which is both a non-negotiable, but I want to sort of get consent on that with our first little activity, which is asking you to share what you think gives someone, what makes someone valuable, excuse me. So you can just put that in the chat. Again, it can be to everyone or just directly to me. This is sort of big picture, and then we're gonna get more specific, but I think it's helpful to ground in this idea of what makes someone valuable. Thank you. Someone wrote being alive makes someone valuable. Thank you for that. Everyone is valuable and worthy. Great. Everyone is valuable because God did not create any junk. Everyone is equal. Each of us is unique and equal. Great. Awesome. Great. So that is a wonderful place to start. I'm glad no one wrote things, well, specifically, let's say about like spelling or the amount of books you read or how much money you make, right? Those are ways that we tend in like capitalism to measure worth. But I really appreciate what you wrote in the chat of like, if you exist, you are worthy and you don't have to contribute anything in a sort of traditional way. You are valuable. So that's where I'm glad we're all coming from. I'm going to share a couple things about language. Not all dyslexic people identify as disabled, but some do. And so I just want to share that I'm going to be using the word disabled. And it's grounded in a lot of ideas from disabled people. This person I'm quoting is disabled, but not dyslexic. Most people I quote today are dyslexic, but this is just such a nice summary. So they wrote, I say disabled instead of person with disabilities because I believe that calling myself disabled is as much about describing my physical pain as it is a critique of capitalism, ableism, and the systems that lead to the disabling aspects of my life. So for example, if we're thinking about dyslexia, right, they're pointing out that that's not something within a person to like fix. Again, there are things we can do to support. That's what we're here to discuss today. But it's sort of more societal, right? There's something about society that is disabling to dyslexic individuals because we're like text obsessed and seem to think that spelling is important, even though like that's not really correlated with anything. And we have technology to support that. And I do just want to say I'm saying disabled instead of things like special needs or differently abled, not to erase potential strengths that disabled people, including dyslexic people, have, but because a lot of disabled people want to point out, again, this like social impact of like, they tend to say that these sound like euphemisms and they are comfortable saying, I am disabled. That puts the problem on the outside, not the inside. The other word I just want to sort of highlight is this idea of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is just the truth that we all have different brains, but the neurodiversity movement acknowledges that truth and that it's like either a good thing and or just a necessary thing. Some people use the metaphor of it being like biodiversity, right? If we have all different kinds of plants, plants are more likely to thrive. It's actually dangerous just to have one kind of plant in the world. So I don't know if it's fair to say that it's dangerous to have one kind of mind, but I actually think that's a true statement. And dyslexic individuals are one of many types of individuals, who are neurodivergent, which is in contrast with people who are neurotypical. And so that's just some terminology. And then the last word for today is intersectionality, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And it just acknowledges that ability is one part of someone's identity and these interact in specific ways. So if you look at, right, so if we're talking about dyslexic individuals also have gender identities and language differences and education differences and so on, and racial differences. But the way that, let's say, a cis white male who's dyslexic experiences the world might be different than the way a Black trans woman experiences the world who's also dyslexic, right? So that's where I'm highlighting that, yeah, all of these interact in meaningful ways. All right, enough of my monologuing. Let's think about what dyslexia means with first thinking about what the world tells us about dyslexia. I'm going to put the task in the chat okay. And it asks you to Google dyslexia or dyslexic. I think it's easier if you do like a Google image search because that's faster to skim and you'll only have 2 minutes to do this. And what do you notice? What's sort of the message that's being sent? Who's centered or who's missing? And then after you're done, I'll invite you to join that, to share that in the chat, or you can also unmute, but we'll just do 2 minutes of that. Actually, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen, even though these dogs are cute, because I think it's easier for you to do the Googling without my screen up. So I'll just keep time and let you know when it's like 15 seconds away. So we'll do about 10 more seconds. And I'll invite you to share in the chat what you noticed. So Jen noticed frustration on the faces of individuals, also floating reversed letters. Yes, and Candace agrees. Yep. Yeah, there's a lot of like head scratching and just confused faces. And then, yeah, the letters floating. Any other noticings? Thank you. Yes, white, yeah, masculine looking students are presumably, yeah. Thank you, Rachel and Candace. I noticed the same thing. It seems to be cis white male presenting folks. And I should acknowledge historically that has been true, but that's a diagnosis issue and not a neurological issue. Right? Unlike humans, these things don't discriminate. So the rate of dyslexia is the same amongst, yeah, regardless of gender and gender identity and race. Scrambled brains as if it's a problem rather than a difference. Thank you, Rachel. And yeah, again, I don't see kids of color or femmes. Yeah, so that's what the world is telling us, and let's change that because that's obviously not true or accurate. Oops, sorry. So let's first do that by centering dyslexic individuals. Here's a video. I'm gonna stop the closed captions. The video actually has Spanish subtitles. So yeah, I'm gonna play that. This is from a person named Jade, who's dyslexic, who I don't know, but I know is a real human because I know some of the people who worked on this video. Yeah. Oops.
My name is Jade. I'm in the 8th grade, and reading is a huge struggle for me. Teacher would ask me to read in front of the class aloud. I'd open my mouth, but no words would come out. Not because I couldn't speak, because I couldn't read the words on the page. They were jumping around, backwards, blurry, sideways. D was a B, W was an M. I just kept it all to myself. Like, no one can relate to me. This is just my problem, and I have to deal with it. I have to find a way to deal with this. Oh my gosh. I can still remember the names. Idiot, dummy, slow, special ed. It's like every day going through that takes a piece of you. After a while, you just like, you get this numb feeling, like it just doesn't bother you anymore. That's when you get really worried. That's when you should get really worried. When you get this numbing feeling, someone calls you and you're like, I don't care. They're right. That's the worst feeling in the world.
Middle and high school students who still struggle with reading.
Oops, sorry, I'm gonna skip ahead because she ends it. There we go. Sorry, I'm not ending on a sad note if that's the worst feeling in the world. I just want to hear from her and not.
I'm reading a book meant for toddlers. In the 1st grade, and I'm reading a book meant for toddlers. I'm a very sad person. I would seriously just say that to myself. And then my mom would come in and she's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I was reading this book. She's like, oh, that's so cute. I'm like, Mom, I can't read. The teacher talked to me. They said, we know that you have this ability and we know how to help you. I would go through one line. She's like, okay, stop. And then she said, and then she had on the board, like, it's like she already knew I was coming. Each word was separated. And she had this special board with like, little dots. And she was like, what does it sound? What is this word? I'm like, it's an S. And I felt really stupid. But at the end of the day, I could say that sentence. I would just walk around at the dinner table. I'm reading. I'm everywhere in the car. I'm sitting down in my roller skates, reading a book. I walked into a treat. I had finished a book and I felt awesome. And she reads the book, dancing around in my dad's football jersey. She's gonna play to the championship. I'm serious. And the crowd goes wild. I still have that jersey. I do. And it smells terrible.
Thanks for the reactions, Jen. Exactly. No, it's kind of devastating and very yeah, it's devastating how people internalize these things about them. And that actually sets us up nicely for it's a great video. We're not watching it twice. For the next activity, we're going to do something called a gallery walk, although there's no actual walking involved. I'll put the task in here in the chat. And I'm going to share the link in a second, but I just want to sort of show you what we're going to do. So here, let me make it bigger. This is called a Jamboard, and once I share the link, you should be able to join, and you can go between the pages. I don't know if you can see near the top by clicking the arrows. So you can click between the arrows, and again, we'll have like 5 to 10-ish minutes, let's say, to do this. I'm going to ask you to pick like 1 or 2 to focus on, but essentially they're all famous folks with who are dyslexic talking about their dyslexic experiences. And I will invite you to add a sticky note, which is just under the arrow. And you can, comment on, she highlights like compensatory strategies, interesting. I think that's what she talked about. And then leave that sticky note there, right? You'll have more time. Or like, I like that she highlights she's a dyslexic adult, not just was a dyslexic child, right? So I will put the link for that in the chat. And there's also a Spanish version that's on Google Slides, which is similar, but if that is supportive. So the English one is on top and the Spanish one is on the bottom. And again, I'll ask you to pick 1 or 2 and add sticky notes with your thoughts, and then we'll debrief because there's some things, I made this and I still have some critiques. And I will stop sharing the screen so it's bigger on your side. And if you have questions, let me know. Again, we'll aim for 5-ish minutes, but I'll see how many post-its there are. Maybe we'll extend a little bit. And we'll do that for about 1 more minute. And yeah, welcome any newcomers. Okay, so I will ask you to jot your last sort of note there and share my screen again to highlight some of the things you all wrote. Sorry, I have too many things that are opened. There we go. Oops, actually that's not true. We'll go back a second. Okay. Ooh, lots of great notes. Great, yay, and people having fun with the Jamboard. So talking about Octavia Spencer focused on her skills and advantages. The sky's the limit when you're supported. Right, this idea of strengths and weaknesses. And perfect example of why we need to keep differentiated learning in the classroom, because not all students learn the same way. Yes, I bet that's a theme throughout, right? Differences are not selective. And right, I think he was really honest about, sad that he was ashamed and thought he was stupid because of other people's reactions. Stuff about Spielberg, finding strategies to suit a specific difference is the key. Greatness is not defined by boundaries. And it's valuable for kids to know that finding a way to do things that are outside of conventional ways are also a success. Can dyslexic students receive a 504 plan? Yes, that is a common accommodation for dyslexic individuals. Students are exceptional, yes, often in oral language, out of the box thinkers. And this reminds me of 2 of my students, right? Their creative ways of thinking. This helps me reframe what they do as a skill set. She and her mother knew she was not stupid. We have to remind our students and colleagues and the world that they're not stupid. The journey is hard, but you do not let it defeat you. And it's the differences between an educator who understands and the difficulties compared to those that don't makes life-changing differences to the students. Greatness is a journey, not a destination. These are great. And that, yeah, this person had a positive attitude. It's a great thing to live within your own skin, which is of course doubly important for Caitlin. God gives us more than one skill. Awesome. Great. Okay. So the one thing I do want to highlight sort of as a self-critique is, right, we started today by recognizing that people have inherent worth. And a lot of these quotes did focus on strengths, and that was intentional because it is true that dyslexic people have innate strengths. And a couple people mentioned, right, that I wasn't stupid or I wasn't dumb. And that's tricky because I'm not really sure what that word means, but that implies, like, I'm dyslexic, I'm not as poorly off as those other people who are stupid and dumb. So I have that tension of, I think we want to tell dyslexic people they're not broken, but without, and again, this is coming from the quotes, not what you wrote about it, not sort of saying you're not dumb, right? Just recognizing that, like, reading is one skill. And I also appreciated, right, that Steve McQueen talked about shame, and that some people did talk about compensations, but Spielberg's like, I'm just not going to read that fast. I just need to give myself extra time, right? He also talked about, he went into the movie business maybe because of how his brain works, right? And some people did say, right, I'm this way because of, not despite, right? Which is true. So that's where, like, I want to absolutely acknowledge strengths, but not do it at the, like, cost of others, if that makes sense. So now let's dive into some tips. The structure of this is, I'm going to share 5 tips and kind of a secret bonus one. And I'm going to sort of intersperse the tips and some quotes or activities. So my first tip is to incorporate interests and choice. Dyslexia is typically like a difficulty with reading and often with decoding, meaning like the letters don't translate to sounds so easily. It can also include difficulties with comprehension, which is understanding. I'm going to break down the different parts of reading in a couple of slides, but essentially it's really easy for, if reading is hard for you, for kids then not to read, right? And that leads to two things. One, it leads to a negative relationship with reading. They're like, well, reading's hard, it sucks, I don't want to do it, and who can blame them? But the other thing is, through reading, we not only learn, like we learn things, including like language things. So kids who read tend to have bigger vocabularies, deeper understandings of like different sentence structures, and even understanding of concepts. So I'm going to talk about technology later, because the point is that if someone is dyslexic and they have difficulty with like making the sounds on the page, make the sounds in their head, if that means that then they don't read, and I'm going to define reading again in a second, then that means they're going to lose out on other things. Like I said, vocabulary, concepts, information, right? That's one way we get information is through reading. So broadly, we want to support interests and choice. So we can support these positive relationships with reading to support this sense of success. It's also authentic. I know, like, obviously I have issues with the way schools are work sometimes, but right, like as an adult, I choose what I read for the most part. I sometimes have to read things for work that I don't want to, but like I have way more choice than any child, and I think that's ridiculous. I also happen to like reading. I'm a skilled and fluent reader. I'm not a fast reader, but like I'm a, you know, pretty okay comprehender. But I choose what I read. I also choose how I read, right? If I want to read an audiobook, or if I want to read a, you know, if I want to read a trashy book, if I want to read an informative book. I also often like have social relationships around readings, right? So that's still around like choice and interest, right? I'm part of more than one book club. Yeah, because I like reading, but I also like to hang out and socialize. And those are the things that we want to support also with students. Again, because it's authentic, but it's also just like quite motivating. And again, reading can be connecting, right? Like I certainly know kids who are like, they're both super obsessed with, I don't know, a certain series, I don't know, Captain Underpants or something, and that can be a great form of connection, right? So that also highlights that reading can be social. I used to always say, and I guess still want to say that, like, so therefore, and this kind of relates to the next tip, if kids want to read the back of a cereal box, that's awesome. Any way, shape, or form that they can form these relationships with reading, that's great. And again, I'm going to talk about other ways that this shows up. Oh, sorry. This is a quote actually from someone who's not dyslexic, but I appreciated the thinking, so I wanted to share it. She's an autistic social worker that I follow on Twitter. And she wrote, "We tend to make fun of folks for not being able to read, but have you ever really stopped to think about how phenomenal and complex the concept of reading is? It's just some squiggles, marks, and lines arranged in a certain way that allows us to communicate ideas. Wild." And it is wild. And I like this because there's like a whole book called Proust and the Squid that's basically about this, about how humans aren't built to read. There's actually no part of our brains that are only devoted for reading. When people read, our brains use all different kinds of systems that were actually made for other things. So reading is really hard. And I actually think it's more amazing that people can read, not that some people have difficulty reading. And so another way of thinking about how complex reading is, this is kind of a fuzzy visual, but I've emailed the publisher, and this is the most high quality picture I can get. It talks about all of these different strands that go into reading. I won't read every word, but basically the top half of this rope has to do with like comprehension. So do you understand what you're reading? Do you know the words? Do you understand the ideas? Do you have the background knowledge? Do you understand the sentences? Can you make relevant inferences or metaphors? Do you have knowledge of literacy? This is particularly a thing for little kids, right? Like little kids need to learn like what books are for, and that like in English, we read left to right and top to down. So that's the part of reading that actually develops forever. Like your vocabulary will always change and your knowledge will always change, which I think is a kind of a positive, beautiful thing that we never stop learning. The bottom chunk, which is called word recognition, has to do with the actual sounds of reading. So are you aware of like that, you know, I'm specifically speaking about English, but actually this is true for Spanish as well. There's sounds that have, certain letters have certain sounds. Spanish is actually much more close. The letters and the sounds have almost one-to-one connection. And in English, it's a little bit different, but basically words are made up of syllables, and there's different sounds that are called phonemes that go into words. And some words you sort of kind of have to memorize, though I should say that English gets sort of a bad rap for being like a random, but over 80% of English written words actually do follow logical rules, so it's not as random as it seems. I'm saying all of this, to point out that reading is hard, and this will build us up for our last sort of bonus strategy, which is validation. So like, it's no wonder that reading can be hard, but also that again, in the rope, half of reading is comprehension. And some dyslexic individuals only have difficulty with word recognition, which that I'll talk about a bit, though I do think that's more of a school-based thing, which I'm cognizant now that there are educators here, but I did tailor this initially for family members and caregivers. But because so much of reading is the understanding part, and because reading has so many different purposes, I think it's important to start with the purpose. Like, why are people reading? Is it to learn, to be entertained, to be persuaded? And again, let's say it's to learn something. You can learn in lots of different ways. You can learn through a video. You can learn through an experience. You can learn by interviewing someone. And this is not to say that reading isn't important, although I do think we're becoming sort of a more visual society. But basically, and again, this maybe is more of a comment for educators now, that like, if students are reading and the purpose is to read, that's fine. But most of school, particularly like after 4th grade, is not learning to read, but reading to learn, right? And in that case, we could be way less text-based about things. There are certain things that most people, and this isn't the same as learning styles, this is just based on like research about education, people learn by doing. So science, for example, is much more meaningful to do in a hands-on experimental way than to read about it. So then that's something that shouldn't require as much reading as other things. The rest of this list also talks about different sort of forms of reading, like graphic novels and comics are awesome, and a lot of dyslexic kids like to read it. Things written in verse, so like Kwame Alexander's like original books, right? Oh my God, I'm blanking on it. I know it's Booked is the second one, but I can't remember the first one. Crossover and Booked, right? Those are entire books that are like, they're sort of like, right, they're written for sort of older kids, but the text itself is somewhat simpler. Closed captioning, as I'm using now, but also with videos, can support reading fluency. So if you're constantly pairing the words with the sounds, that's supportive. And again, depending on the purpose of reading, wordless books or movies can be helpful, because again, that helps build this idea of like, what's a part of a story? Yeah, mostly wordless books and movies are stories. So particularly for younger learners that are learning the parts of a story or like things like that, that can be a sort of relatively painless way of addressing all of the things that go into reading that have nothing to do with letters, but is still valuable. I sort of alluded to technology before and also outed myself as someone who really likes technology. The list you see here of audiobooks and text-to-speech and speech-to-text and graphic organizers and typing and so much more all used to be so inaccessible. And now they're all built into every device everywhere, right? Everyone's phone has dictation software and text-to-speech and word prediction and all of that. In case you're worried that some people talk about if kids use assistive technology, somehow that will like hinder them. I don't even use the word crutch because that's meaningless. We want people to have crutches who need them. Again, back to the point earlier of like kids who don't read lose out on the other reading skills like background knowledge and vocabulary and stuff. Assistive technology helps students experience not only less shame, but also more access. Then they can read books that they're interested in. So it links to strategy 1 and that are sort of on their, you know, on their level. I don't know how else to phrase that, right? Again, and audiobooks are sometimes free. There are sites like Learning Ally, and there's another one that starts with book something, it's in the resource list, that if you have a diagnosis, it's free, but there's also like LibriVox, I think it's it wrote it right, LibriVox has a lot of free audiobooks, and so do most libraries have free audiobooks. So certainly for like narratives and plays and things like that, audiobooks are great. Text to speech in other ways, and that sort of more robot voice can be hard to understand. And then there's things like graphic organizers that again teaches the ideas of text structure, which is like, okay, what are the parts of a how-to? What are the parts of a story? How do you make an argument? So those can be supportive, particularly for dyslexic individuals who also have difficulties or differences with comprehension. And again, I will share resources at the end. There's no point in us going through like different tools. And I guess I should also highlight, right, dyslexia is a difficulty with reading, but it often, reading and writing are so closely related that that's why I have things like word prediction and voice typing, because most kids who have difficulty with decoding or reading also have difficulty with like spelling, which is the fancy word for is encoding. So those are the first three. It's interests. It's that reading can come in a lot of different ways and forms, and using technology. Again, if at any point there are questions, you are welcome to add it to the chat. The next one is about partnering with schools. So this is interesting that we have a mixed group, but actually this is relevant to both sides. There is a image here that's actually in Spanish, and I used an online translator to translate it. So we'll hear from our interpreter maybe if it's not accurate, but it says it's not dyslexia that condemns a lost childhood studying without games or free time. It's a system that insists on grading what is read, written, and memorized, and not what is learned, related, thought, or invented. And I think it's amazing, and I think links back to like some of the things I highlighted on the land acknowledgement slide, right? That school really shouldn't just be this like regurgitation. So the first point I have is content over form. I hope that no one is using like a red pen to mark up students' writing anymore, or the equivalent on like a Google Doc. But essentially, again, this goes then for educators if you're on that side, and for family members and caregivers, it's up to you to sort of advocate for that. But again, the partnership is for everybody. That, yeah, again, particularly in older grades where we don't even like think about spelling as far as like it's not taught. I mean, I don't really believe in grading, but if there is grading, grade kids' ideas and not how things are spelled. And again, one of the strategies here is also access to technology, and that can help a great deal with things like spelling. So that's content over form is for, again, spelling tests and things like that. No memorizing spelling tests. Again, I hope that people aren't doing this anymore, but I know when I was a kid, and I did used to also provide supports for certain students who had like theme-based spelling tests. It would be like Halloween, and you could have cat, then you could have witch, and then you could have the word Halloween all on one list, and you had to memorize it. And that is not supportive, I think, for any individuals, but it certainly is not helpful for dyslexic individuals. So I sort of have two things for that depending on your role. If you're an educator, please don't do this. Reading programs that support dyslexic learners sometimes do have tests, but they're not based on memorization. They're based on like, this week we're learning this rule, like we're learning at words. So we're gonna do cat and gnat and bat, and kids don't go home and memorize it. The point is they will have practiced it enough that they will just know. And the way that these reading programs are structured, and they're usually under the umbrella of Orton-Gillingham. Wow, it spelled that right. So Orton-Gillingham, which like Wilson has a program like that. There's Recipe for Reading. There's PAF, which stands for Preventing Academic Failure, which is a terrible phrase, but anyway, so those are programs that really focus on making sure kids know, understand spelling rules and things like that. And there are assessments, but they're not memorizing spelling tests. So one is do that if you're an educator and you are trained to do that. For family members, this is maybe a bold thing, but just like try to get your kids to, if somehow their educators insist on doing this, opt them out. I feel like if you, I don't know, even if you like don't take, or let's like any spelling tests in second grade, that can't like impact the rest of your life, or I certainly hope not. And again, I don't want to give you bad advice that does consequence your kid's future, but I just cannot see how like a first grade spelling test means you can't go to college or whatever, if that's what, you know, kids want to do. I want to reiterate creative ways to learn and show learning, right? When I talked about different forms of reading, that's relevant for educators too. If the purpose isn't, again, decoding, then why can't kids watch a video, listen to a podcast, do an interview? Let me make sure everyone's muted. And again, technology is something that hopefully you don't necessarily have to advocate for as a caregiver or educator. And it's okay to ask questions, obviously, too. Spelling words that relate to concepts, yes, as long as, right, it matches a sort of pattern, right? Because I do think a lot of spelling tests are really random. And I say ask questions because there are certain things that are part of this Orton-Gillingham reading program that seem unintuitive. Like one thing that it includes is books without pictures, which sounds no fun, but the whole point is that then kids don't rely on guessing, they learn all the rules. Those books are also boring, and that's fine. The purpose of those books isn't to develop this like rich idea of what's it called? Of like stories and stuff, right? Students should be exposed to stories, and sometimes they read the boring little books that help them develop their decoding abilities. And I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to start to wind down. There's sort of like one more strategy and a bonus one, and then we'll have 1 minute for a reflection. A couple of things. So disclosure is telling your kids that they are dyslexic. Again, this is for caregivers because as educators, you're not allowed to. Share with your kids that they are dyslexic and try to develop a positive dyslexic identity. It's sort of analogous to individuals who are adopted, like the earlier and the more normalized it is, and it's like not a big deal, that's like helpful. As I said, it's not necessary for dyslexic kids to have strengths, but there are strengths. This like Be Mind acronym is based off of this idea that people who are dyslexic have like strengths in business, empathy, like spatial, material or spatial reasoning. Again, this will all be in the follow-up. Interconnectedness, so again, that's sort of like reasoning, narrative reasoning, which again is more about like writing and like about personal experiences. And the final one is dynamic reasoning, which is like thinking creatively. So when we looked through the Jamboard, you might have noticed that some of those people were, yeah, things like filmmakers or business leaders or other types of like creative big idea thinkers, right? A lot of representation is bad. So I'm gonna link in the resources some books and other things about dyslexic people, and then that includes role models, right? Everyone I shared in the Jamboard is like famous and maybe meaningful to your kids or students, and there might be people from real life, right? Uncle so-and-so or neighbor so-and-so or auntie so-and-so is also dyslexic. And then the bonus strategy is validate, right? Like it can be hard and it can be frustrating, and if let's say there's some sort of meaningless spelling test, I think it's okay to highlight that that's a meaningless spelling test, and also that your worth isn't linked to your ability to spell. So in our sort of like final-ish minute, I wanted to give you a minute just to sort of reflect on this, and then I'll end on a quote. To consider something, and you can share it if you'd like in the chat, something you will continue to do based on this, something you will maybe start doing, and or something you will stop doing. And I know there were sort of lots of things. If it helps, I can leave all this summarized, all the tips here. So I'll pause for a moment, and I do see the time, so I'm going to read a quick poem or part of a poem at the end. Oh, I have annotations turned on, cool. This is from, again, a dyslexic individual. It's part of a longer poem, and he wrote, I wanted to quit, but had to recommit. Warehoused in special education, barely reading. Over time, I became self-liberated and now leading. Now I love to write, which allows me to give insight. And I think that's hopefully a powerful note to end on. And now, again, I know it's 7:31, so if you need to go, by all means, we will share follow-up resources and a recording, because that was a lot. I can just show you that there is like a resource list that I'm going to share. Don't worry about writing that down. You'll get it in the follow-up. And yes, but if you do have questions now, you can unmute or put it in the chat. And if you need to go, thank you for sharing space and time with us tonight. Awesome, Rachel, this is great. I'll continue to enjoy a variety of information sources and focus on reading for fun, yay. I will start using technology more for written work and stop stressing about their spelling difficulties, yeah. And again, the world isn't necessarily supportive of that, but there's lots of, yeah, just spelling isn't as important as I think some people think. Excellent, thank you, Yvonne, for coming. And yeah, thank you, Rachel, for your comments too. Great, again, thanks everyone for coming.